Good morning. I'm presenting a webinar on examining employment impacts of vocational rehabilitation service provision for persons with autism spectrum disorder. My name is David Dean. I'm working on this project with a colleague at the University of Richmond, Robert Schmidt. We have a little group there called the Bureau of Disability Economics Research at the University of Richmond. We're also working with two economists from University of Virginia, Dr. Stephen Stern and Dr. John Pepper, and they're going to be helping us out in the last year of the project, which I'll discuss in a moment. In terms of goals of the project, the overarching goal is to identify for those VR consumers who have ASD, we are looking at the efficacy of a specific mix of VR services in terms of looking at basically employment outcomes for these individuals. We think that there's two different types of generic services that VR provides. One of them are called labor force attachment services, which basically get you a job. It's sort of a short-run outcome. And then there's what's called human capital development, and human capital development would be sort of a longer-term job training, education services. And these tend to have differential impacts in terms of both short and long-term employment-related outcomes. Those outcomes that we're looking at in this project are twofold. We're looking at employment probabilities. Did you get a job in a given period or not? And then if you were working in that period, what are the earnings for that given period? One of the unique aspects of this particular project is that we're also controlling for the receipt of federal disability benefit payments. In particular, what we're interested in looking at is what is the influence of receiving either supplemental security income or disability insurance benefit payments. Does that impact on your employment? Does your employment impact on the receipt of those services? And so we're seeking to address the interaction of those receipt of those benefits on employment. This is a 5-year project that we're working on, and we are sort of in abeyance. This is the 4th year of the project. We're in abeyance in the 4th year. And so what I'll be presenting this morning is sort of the initial preliminary findings, if you will, from the first 3 years of the project. And we've really been, in the first 3 years, we've been trying to overcome the data challenges in looking at employment impacts for persons with ASD and getting VR services. And the issue is one of obtaining longitudinal data. And so we're going to talk about some of the challenges in trying to examine the impacts of VR services for these individuals. The biggest problem is that there's not any one agency that collects and maintains this longitudinal information that we need. And so we have to collect the data from 3 separate agencies. First of all, we get information about the individual and their case and the resulting purchase services that they received. We get that from the Virginia Department of Rehabilitative Services. The earnings information, employment data that we're getting is really coming from 2 sources. Our primary source of data when we're looking at the Virginia cohort is quarterly earnings that we receive from the Virginia Employment Commission. The Virginia Employment Commission generally keeps available about 20 quarters of earnings information for individuals, and that presents some difficulties when you want to go back and look at prior earnings for individuals. And so we'll talk about that in a bit. The last source of information that we have is monthly disability insurance and supplemental security income benefit payments that we're receiving, that we get from the Social Security Administration. They have something called the ticket research file for the Ticket to Work program, and they've merged that information with the RSA 911 case service report, which is a standardized reporting format that every state VR agency has to report on an annual basis to the Rehab Services Administration. We are eventually going to be able to obtain the individual level monthly DI and SSI benefit payments, and in our last year of the project we are going to be able to incorporate that individual benefit payment information into our analysis. One thing that you will not be able to obtain on an individual level basis is the annual earnings that are maintained at Social Security for these individuals. These earnings records are much more accurate, if you will, than Virginia Employment Commission earnings, in that their coverage rates are much broader, and they use the earnings for different reasons, but we do not have access to the individual level earnings. And so when we look at Social Security earnings, we have someone up at the Social Security Administration who does all the programming, and they provide us with the output, so we do not have access to that individual level data. So what we're going to be talking about is two different data sets, and our goal ultimately is to merge information from these data sets together so that we can do a very comprehensive examination of these employment outcomes that we're really interested in. The first cohort that we'll be discussing are applicants to the Virginia Department of Rehab Services. Now we have a broad longitudinal group of cohorts here. The primary group that we started off with and that we've been doing most of our work with are applicants in State Fiscal Year 2000. A couple years back we decided that we wanted to update that applicant cohort, and so we have another applicant cohort that we used in this project, and those are applicants in State Fiscal Year 2007. Now in the intervening time of 2001 through 2006, we have got information about those individuals in terms of their service receipt from the DRS, but we don't have information about their earnings because, as I mentioned before, the Virginia Employment Commission only has 5 years of earnings that you can go back to, and so we could only get earnings right now in 2012 for a cohort that started in 2007. Fortunately, we've been able to identify an archive data set at the Virginia Employment Commission that has earnings back to 1998. And so our goal is to have a long-term longitudinal look at applicants with 8 different cohorts, actually, from State Fiscal Year 2000 all the way through State Fiscal Year 2007. But what we're reporting on this morning are the applicants in just State Fiscal Year 2000 and then State Fiscal Year 2007. So we're going to be looking at the quarterly earnings for those individuals. The 2007 applicant cohort is still obviously an active cohort in terms of receipt of services. Some of them are still receiving services from the DRS. And so we don't have earnings after they've left the program. We have earnings that we're looking at right now. We track everything at the point of application. So we're going to be able to look at their earnings in several quarters prior to the application for VR services, and this morning we're looking at, I believe, 8 quarters after they applied for VR services. When we come back at the end of the project, we'll be able to report on annual earnings, and we'll hopefully have annual earnings through 12. So for the 2007 applicant cohort, those would be, we're thinking we're going to have 5 years of post-application earnings for that 2007 cohort, and we'll be able to compare at least 5 years of post-application earnings for all of these cohorts that we're looking at. We also, through the Virginia Department of Rehab Services, we're able to track longitudinally the services that these individuals receive. As we'll see shortly, we've got the service files for all people who come to the VR program from 1988 through basically the present. And so we can look at not just the stint that occurred in VR through 2000 or 2007, we can look at VR stints that occur prior to 2000 and then subsequent to 2000 as well. The second cohort that we're going to be looking at is comes from that Social Security RSA 9/11 closure file. What we are able to look at there are all nationwide closures from VR from the period 1998 through 2008. This particular file has the same information that you could obtain from any state agency that reports, obviously, to the RSA. Those include demographic information, socioeconomic variables, disability status, and they also have the total dollar amount of purchased VR services. There's a little bit more information available at the state level than there is reported at the federal level, and so we can just look at total dollars, not the individual types of services that are received. We don't have any information about the dollar value of individual services, just in the aggregate. A large virtue of that data set, though, is that they do have this monthly benefit receipt of DI and SSI information. And of course, the most important contribution is that they've got these aggregated annual earnings, and those are available from for a 20-year period, going from 1991 through 2010, and they update these annually now, so it's an ongoing series, and you're able to keep on tracking these individuals. So the first group that we're going to report on, the cohort that we're going to look at, are the Virginia DRS applicant cohorts in State Fiscal Year 2000 and 2007. One of the problems with looking at state-level data for small sample sizes is that you don't really have large enough groups of individuals to do meaningful statistical analysis on the objects that we're interested in, which are employment-related outcomes. So it started out in State Fiscal Year 2000, we only had 59 individuals who applied for VR services in State Fiscal Year 2000, and by 2007 that had more than quadrupled, and we had 244 applicants in that last year of our analysis. Now, what you typically do with the standard 9/11 data is you look at the outcomes, of what are called closure statuses of these individuals, and the 2000 applicant cohort, about half of them ultimately ended up from this particular stint that we're talking about, the application in State Fiscal Year 2000, they ended up, about half of them ended up in what is called a rehabilitated, successfully rehabilitated status. That means that they have employment that lasted for at least 90 days. Another quarter of those individuals who applied and got significant services ultimately ended up not having employment at the time of closure from the VR program. That doesn't mean that they don't eventually get employment. It was, however, at the time of closure, they had not had employment recorded on the 9/11 file. There's another sixth, about 16% or so of the individuals who applied for VR services and then ultimately dropped out prior to getting a plan implemented. And the last remaining group, which is about 8%, 1 out of every 12 individuals or so, they either withdrew or were not accepted for services. And there are a few individuals who are actually still receiving services as of 2007, the last time we were updating the services for these individuals. So what we're interested in doing at one level is relating the costs of the services to the employment outcomes. And so we're able to look at the individual services that these we're able to look at the services that these individuals get, and we're able to look at specific types of services that they get. What we're looking at here is just the aggregate dollar value of those services. It turns out that these 59 individuals, during what we're calling their base case, that is the application that occurred in State Fiscal Year 2000, the total dollar value of purchased services was about $133,000, which averages some $2,256 per individual. When you go and start looking at who's getting this $133,000 worth of services, well, it turns out those individuals who were successfully rehabilitated are getting much more in the way of purchased services. Their average dollar value was $3,614, whereas the individuals, remember, about a quarter of this cohort, so we're talking about 15 individuals in terms of numbers here, about a quarter of the cohort that was not successfully rehabilitated, their purchase services were still significant. They received about $1,900 in the way of purchase services. Recall that so far we've been talking about what we refer to as the base case. When you're looking at individuals getting VR services, it is not unusual for them to have either prior stints to the base case as well as subsequent cases. That is, they get closed from the stint that occurred in State Fiscal Year 2000. They come back for more services. And so it turns out that in State Fiscal Year 2000, about 1/3 of these individuals, so again now that's about 20 or so, had prior stints of VR before the application in State Fiscal Year 2000. And another quarter, and they could be some of these same individuals, so again we're talking now about 15 individuals or so, had a subsequent VR stint. And what we're able to do with this longitudinal VR service file is we don't look at cases as is typically done. We look at individuals, and we see that over time these individuals are having multiple VR spells, and we want to account for that in our analysis. And so we're looking at the total dollar value of all of these VR stints. And so it turns out that the average cost of the purchase services, when you look at all of the stints that the individuals receive, increases by more than two-thirds to some $3,733. So we've looked at the service provision, and the next thing that we've been able to collect information on is the employment outcomes. And when I say outcomes, we're interested in looking at what their employment is prior to coming to VR, because obviously your pre-program history has a lot of bearing on how you're going to do after you leave the program. The normal amount of information collected on the RSA 911 is earnings in the week prior to application for services, and we think that's a very crude measure of what the individual's capabilities really are in terms of their earnings, right? You'd like to look several quarters, if not years, prior to application to see what these individuals are earning. And so what we're looking at now are the 4 quarters immediately preceding the quarter in which application took place. We have earnings during the quarter of application, and we'll be looking at earnings in the 8 quarters following the quarter of application. If you can look carefully at what we're reporting here, we have the 2 different cohorts that are in the left-hand side, and the top panel is looking at an employment rate The way that figure is calculated is by looking at the total number of individuals in the cohort and seeing how many of them had any VEC reported earnings in that quarter, and we're just reporting that ratio. And that's what's provided in the top panel for the State Fiscal Year 2000 applicant cohort, as well as the State Fiscal Year 2007 applicant cohort. You can see the number of cases are reported in the first column, and then we're looking at pre-program, pre-VR application employment rates in the following 4 quarters, and you can see that roughly about 1/5 of the time, 1/4 of the time, these individuals are working in the quarters leading up to application. The State Fiscal Year 2000 applicant cohort, and during the time of application, the quarter of application, about 1/3 of them were actually working during the quarter in which application took place. The 2007 applicant cohort, only 22%. So that would be, less than a quarter are working during the quarter in which the application took place. The following 8 quarterly periods show that the employment rates generally are going up. Again, these are post-application. They are not post-closure, as most reporting of VR outcomes is usually looking at after they've been closed from the program. Again, we're looking our reference point at the time of application, and so it's not surprising if they are getting significant VR services. They're in a training program, perhaps getting some secondary or post-secondary education at this time. It would not be surprising that to see that a lot of these people, in fact, are not working. And so we see that roughly a quarter to 1/3 of the time these individuals are working in any given quarter. The bottom panel of this slide is showing the earnings if they were employed in any of those quarters. And again, we're looking at the period 1 year prior and 2 years subsequent to application for services. And you can see that the earnings, they generally are in the range of $1,000 to $2,000 per quarter. We don't want to make too much of these particular earnings for these short intervals after application in terms of looking at the impacts of VR services, because again, most of these individuals are receiving VR services during these quarters. In fact, if you're looking at the earnings for individuals in these post-application quarters, we're probably seeing that these are the earnings for those individuals who have left the program after their application but not getting significant services. So the second cohort that we're interested in looking at, second groups of cohorts, if you will, are those that are from the 9/11, the National 9/11 Ticket Research File. Again, these are all closures nationwide that took place during the periods federal fiscal year 1998 through 2008. So that's 11 years of different cohorts that we're able to report on. One of the challenges, if you will, of looking at longitudinal data, trying to make comparisons over time with different cohorts, is that sometimes there's changes in the collection of data elements, and one of those occurred after State Fiscal Year 2001 and implemented in Federal Fiscal Year 2002. You can see the very dark double bolded line going through the period 2001 through 2002, designating the break in when different types of data were collected. The second bolded demarcation occurs at the end of the 2008 column, and so what we'll be reporting on is to the right of that, basically. That's the average, or the total, if you will, for all 11 years worth of separate cohorts. The interesting thing to look at in terms of the trend over time, now these are individuals who could have either a primary or a secondary classification of their disability as being autism spectrum disorder. The numbers of individuals, starting in the top row, increased from 1998 through 2001, and then when they started with a new definition of the disability variables, so they went from what was called a 3-digit disability classification to a 4-digit one. The 4-digit disability classification had both the cause as well as the type of impairment. So they totally changed the way that they were categorizing disability conditions in 2002. And you see there was a marked drop-off from 1,621 in 2001, a loss of about a quarter, down to 1,236 closures in 2002. But if you track across in subsequent periods, you see the marked pickup in the number of closures. By 2008, there were over 3,000 closures nationwide that had a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. The primary classification of autism was for 4/5 or 80% of these individuals. So the converse would be that 1/5 of these 18,000 individuals were reporting autism as a secondary disabling condition. Overall, more than 60% of these individuals had 2 or more different diagnoses. And another variable that is available on the national RSA 911 closure file is the severity of the disabling condition. And 19 out of 20, 94.6% of these individuals are classified as severely disabled. The second type of information that you can get off of the national 911 closure files, in addition to the type and extent of the disability, are the standard sort of demographics. I'm just going to summarize what occurred over the entire 11-year period that we're looking at in terms of closure cohorts. Again, there was a break in the types of information that was collected, and that's particularly relevant in terms of education. So they used to collect information about education at they didn't collect information about education at closure prior to 2002, so we don't have that information available. Starting with the upper right-hand corner, we're looking now at the various demographic attributes. The average age for these 18,000 individuals was just over 22 years. It turns out that 5 out of every 6, roughly 83%, 84% of these individuals are male, and they are also 5 out of 6 are also Caucasian. Roughly about 40% of the cohort has at least a high school diploma. Another important variable, one that we think is crucial in looking at employment impacts, is the receipt of these federal disability benefit payments, and it turns out that more than 40% of these individuals are in fact receiving SSI, and they collect information about application at SSI, both at application as well as at closure, and so we see over 40% had receipt of SSI at the time of application, and also about 1 out of every 8 individuals, actually 11.6%, had received were receiving disability insurance benefit payments at the time of application. The next bit of information that is standard reporting on the RSA 911 is the total dollar value of purchased services received. Again, at the state level, you can look at specific types of services. You can look at diagnostic services, training, education, restorative. You can look at the dollar value of those purchased services, and we think that's the biggest virtue of using state level data, is that different services are going to have different impacts on employment outcomes. And unfortunately, at the national level, you're only able to look at the total dollar value of purchased services, and you can't allocate it across the specific types. They do have binary designations of did you receive one of 22 different service categories, but again, you can't tell the dollar value of the purchased services within any one of those 22 categories. Just the total purchased dollars of VR services. So moving again to the upper right-hand corner, we're talking about the average now across all 11 years worth of cohorts. The dollar value of purchased services for all 18,000 individuals is $3,252. Now it turns out that about a quarter of these individuals who were closed over that 11-year period, about a quarter of them received nothing in the way of purchased VR services. That's not surprising if they didn't pursue their application or if they withdrew their application, didn't follow up on their application, or dropped out for whatever reason. It's not surprising that they would receive $0 of purchased services. So the next row down is the dollar value of purchased services if you received any at all. And so you can see that figure turns out to be some $4,300 of purchased VR services. The next bit of information that is standard reporting on the 911, of course, is the closure status. Now, the closure status is, of course, looking at different things. Were you employed or were you not employed, or did you get into the program at all? It turns out that the average of these 18,000 individuals, over 40% of them were ultimately successfully rehabilitated. About a quarter of the individuals were not successfully rehabilitated. That means that they got significant VR services. They didn't have an employment outcome, though, when they were closed from the VR program. And another quarter or so had dropped out prior to getting a plan implemented. So they hadn't received significant services at all. And the remaining individuals had either withdrawn prior to a plan being implemented, were determined to be not eligible for services for reasons of being either too severely disabled or perhaps not severely enough disabled to qualify for VR services. So what we're really interested in looking at these national closure data is the information on employment outcomes. And again, we think that employment outcomes are very much a function of the receipt of monthly DI or SSI benefit payments. And we have 11 different closure cohorts that we could look at. What we'll report on this morning are just the closure cohort that has the longest amount of receipt of either employment information or disability benefit payment information. And that would be the 983 closures from VR nationwide that took place during federal fiscal year 1998. Again, the reason why we're choosing this group, they've got the longest post-VR closure time period to look at a real longitudinal examination of both their disability benefit payment receipt as well as the amount of their earnings. So what we're looking at then is we have 11 years of post-VR closure information for this particular year of closures, and we've got up to 7 years of earnings information for these individuals. We don't have that amount of DI/SSI information because that information is only available from 1994 through the present. This rather dense table is showing the receipt of, in the top panel, receipt of SSI benefit payments, and in the bottom panel we're looking at receipt of disability insurance benefit payments. The layout of the table is that the column headings are corresponding to the annual period prior to or subsequent to the year in which closure took place. The closure year could be thought of as year 0, if you would, and then intervals to the left of that are going to be pre-closure years. So you see the first -1 is corresponding to the first year prior to closure, so that would be calendar year 1997 mostly. And we go back to 7 years prior to that closure year, and then we go up to plus 12 in terms of 12 years post-closure. We only have partial information available for that 12th year post-closure, so you can really disregard that last column. So what do you observe in terms of the trend for these individuals? Again, less than 1,000 individuals we're looking at here who had closed in federal fiscal year 1998. Well, in the closure year of 1998, we see that 619 individuals were receiving SSI payments sometime during that year. The second row entry is the number of months in that year that they received those payments, and the last row entry is the average dollar amount of payments that they received for SSI during that year. And so these 619 individuals, just to give some background on that number, we sent 983, they have 983 individuals who are closed. SSA then verifies those individuals by looking at their social security number, their date of birth, and gender, and they try to match them up with Social Security earnings and disability benefit files, and they were able to verify a total of 901 of those individuals. So that meant there were some 82 individuals who didn't have valid information, were dropped from the sample. And out of those 901 that were verified, for SSIs, there were some 717 that had some information in the SSI file. That means that they might have applied for SSI, not necessarily received it. So out of that 717 that had information, we find that 619 of them were receiving SSI benefits in the year of closure, which is 1998. And again, the average dollar amount of SSI payments, $5,702. Now that dollar amount actually is going down. These are in 2009 dollars, and so when you adjust for inflation, you see that the benefit payments are not keeping up with inflation for these individuals. They're still, on average, receiving them for 11 months over the entire interval that we're looking at, but the average dollar benefit payment in real 2009 dollars is actually going down. By 11 years after closure, the annual benefit payments are $4,897. So, a loss of some $800 in terms of annual payments compared to those in 1998. The most important thing, I think, though, to look at in terms of this particular top panel is the trend in the number of recipients. So there's a steady increase from the period 4 years prior to closure for these individuals, up to 619. So we go from 391 up to 619. That, in fact, the year of closure is the peak year for receipt of SSI. There's a drop-off for whatever reason. By 11 years after closure, so now we're talking in the late 2000s at this point, there's only 395 of those individuals that reported still receiving SSI payments in that year. And that is a marked contrast in what's occurring in the bottom panel, which is reporting the DI benefit payments for this same cohort. So again, the number is 901 individuals who were verified as being potentially able to receive these benefit payments. Turned out that only 582 had actually applied or were receiving DI benefit payments. And so when you're looking at the bottom panel now, you see that in the closure year there were 327 individuals getting DI benefit payments, and the dollar amount of these benefit payments is $6,549. DI benefit payments are tied to the consumer price index. That means they are inflation adjusted, and so that you can see that these individuals, in terms of their annual dollar value of DI benefit payment receipt, is in fact going up over the series, that they increased to some $8,740 by 11 years after they've been closed. The other important item to note in that bottom panel is that the trend in terms of receipt of DI benefit payments is always going up. So we start off 4 years prior to closure. There's only 169 of these individuals receiving DI, but there's a steady increase. By the time 11 years after they've been closed, we're up to 523 of these individuals that are on the DI rolls. So a marked contrast between DI receipt versus SSI receipt. And another issue, of course, is that some of these individuals could be, at that point, concurrently receiving both DI and SSI benefit payments. The last item that we're going to look at this morning is the earnings for those individuals. Again, we're looking at this 1998 closure cohort of the 983. Again, 901 were actually verified. We found that some 829 had information. What does that mean? That means they had earnings in at least one of these annual closure periods. The earnings at the Social Security Administration are on an annual basis, not a quarterly basis like we see from the Virginia Employment Commission. And so we're not able actually to break out quarterly earnings, which would be interesting to look at some level, but they do have annual earnings, and you can see the annual earnings for these individuals. Again, these are in 2009 dollars, are generally increasing over the range from now we can go 7 years prior to closure. We don't have that many individuals who were actually working at that point in time. So again, 7 years prior to closure, there's 226 out of these 901 individuals, 226 who had any earnings in the entire year. If they had earnings during that year, their earnings were $5,656. In the closure year, again, we're looking at 648 individuals, and their earnings are about the same, $5,642. However, when you go up to 11 years after closure, the last year for which we have full information, the number of individuals who report earnings in that period is only 467. So there's a pretty steady drop from the year of closure, again, where the most amount of people are working in that year, and then every year thereafter there's a drop in the number of people working. So there's only 467 in the 11th year post-closure. However, if they're earning, their earnings are going up. And again, these are in inflation-adjusted 2009 dollars. Those are annual earnings turn out to be $8,304. So what are we going to do with that information? The last year of the project is going to try to merge together the information from these two very different data sources so that we'll be able to take advantage of the national sample in terms of the larger sample sizes. We're going to use the Virginia data to develop our initial earnings impacts, and we're able to control now for the receipt of DI and SSI because we have that individual level information available to us. We also have the Virginia Employment Commission earnings going back to 1998 for these individuals. And so we have a much longer look at what their earnings are, and so we'll be able to take advantage of the larger sample size that we have that took place from 2000 through 2007 in Virginia, and we'll be able to make comparisons with the nationwide sample. We hope to be able to report back on that at the end of federal fiscal year 2013. Thank you.